welcome to everybody in our series of CeSCoS interviews with illustrious guests to the Center, the Study of Contemporary Solidarity at the University of Vienna. And today we have Professor John Boswell, Professor in Politics and Public Policy at the University of Southampton. We're very, very pleased. Just by way of a short introduction for people who might not know you, John is one of the more playful and creative minds in the somewhat staid world of policy studies, and works in a number of different fields: deliberative democracy, interpretive policy analysis, bureaucratic encounters, of which we will talk today, among other things, role of expertise in democratic politics. And he published and co-published a series of books on magical thinking in public policy, and I want to start with that book, but also on comparative research and deliberative democracy and assorted topics. So to start with that fascinating title, Magical Thinking in Public Policy. So to many uninitiated readers, this is somewhat provocative, because public policy and policy studies tries to present itself as a rational, evidence-based enterprise, and here comes somebody who claims that there's a lot of magical thinking going on in public policy. Can you say a little bit more of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Hick, for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invite here to Vienna. It's an absolutely wonderful stay. So the magical thinking is an idea in it's in other social sciences, so particularly psychology, but it's also, I think, originally from cultural anthropology, and the idea of why do people keep like superstition? Why do you keep believing in things that your rational mind knows can't be true or can't work? And I struck on it as a deliberately provocative kind of way of thinking about why so many of the policy practitioners, and I mean that in a broad sense, sort of people who work in government, but also people who are stakeholders and experts who are trying to influence policy, why so many of them would push on what I call ideals of how to do policy making better, things like collaboration, evidence-based policy making, citizen participation, why they would keep coming back to these ideals and pushing them as a new way of doing policy making, when in more private reflections they were often quite cynical about what these things could achieve or how they would tend to go. And so there was this sort of disconnect that struck me as a version, a kind of a version of magical thinking. The other side, is that I drew on a concept from a couple of very well-known public administration scholars, so Christopher Pollitt and Peter Hooper, and they have written about magic concepts already. So that was a kind of a live notion or idea in the literature, and they're very critical, and they in a sense use it as a concern about the spread of buzzwords and ideas of the sort I'm talking about. But I actually meant it in a more, if you read the book, it sounds critical and provocative, but actually I meant it in a more of a spirit of admiration overall for the kind of stoicism and quiet stoicism, particularly of actors who try and pursue progressive change against the odds, or can often feel very futile and frustrating. So it was a kind of an attempt to rescue it.
So you're saying policymakers need these ideas that they know deep in their heart, or not so deep in their heart, but they know that they don't work, or they will constantly be frustrated in the way they have to implement those ideas and strategies. But why then not just look for better ideas, better strategies?
Well, it's because they remain useful to them. So there's a kind of a sense, it's very much in the interpretive mode of why do people use terms? Why do people use the language they use? And they use it because it's useful, quite simply. And so the book tries to kind of disaggregate the ways in which it's useful, the ways in which it helps people to overcome the challenges of complexity and uncertainty and polarization in policy.
Can you give an
making.
example of such an idea is useful to policymaking?
Yes. Okay. So if we look at evidence-based policymaking, which is probably the most well known, so evidence-based policymaking is an idea when you speak to people, everybody will off camera, as it were, when the tape's not rolling, will be really cynical about it. This is not how politics works. This is not how policy making works. We know there are all sorts of things that get in the way, political rationales or brute self-interest and all sorts of things that get in the way, and they're acutely aware of it. But it can help them to win arguments if you couch claims in terms of evidence. And so, the example I look at in the book is around the establishment of NICE guidelines on bariatric surgery for treating obesity. So this is, now the big move in obesity treatment has moved more towards these hormonal treatments. But at the time I was writing it, the kind of magic bullet solution was potentially surgery, bariatric surgery. And a lot of the debate, even though in practice actually a lot of the moral debate was really about the appropriateness of using invasive surgery, for this cause. The debate that was had in the public realm was actually much more around, couched in terms of evidence. So it became this kind of evidence, in a sense, is a kind of secular faith, something that everybody believes in, and it provides a kind of common ground to help them ground their terms when they don't really agree on the fundamental philosophical things that are pushing them in different directions.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on, for reasons of time, to your current work on encounters of citizens with administrative agencies. There you have observed that citizens use all sorts of strategies of resistance. In a discussion we had before, people said, well, maybe a better term is agency, to gain some control over those encounters. Because of the considerable power asymmetries. So there are two very interesting aspects. First of all, the substantive aspects, so I would like to hear more of what you have observed. And second, you use a particular methodology that I would like to hear more about too. But let's start with your substantive observations.
Right, okay. Yeah. So this was, it's been a long-term kind of interest, or it's something I came across as I was reading work for that previous project, in particular work by people like Joe Soss, Alan Stewart and others, who were gesturing towards this idea of street-level service use. And I thought that's an interesting idea, and various experiences in the field and so on kind of made me think, well, this would be an interesting thing to look at. So I went away and had a look at what is the kind of the weapons of the weak that people use in their engagement with the state, and through a process of reading a lot of ethnographies, and I'll talk about the method in a minute, coming across that there are very different strategies that people will use. So one is around dissent, and in particular the most common one there is simply evasion or withdrawal. They just refuse to engage with the state or with on the terms that the state put. So we see this a lot in, for example, welfare, people just dropping out of welfare programs, in terms of engagement with police and parole and so on, just being evasive, not engaging with the state. And there are other strategies that are more like what I call dissociation, a kind of detaching from negative stigmas associated with the engaging in asymmetrical power relations. So in lay terms, faking it to make it. And so you see this in lots of, particularly again in welfare bureaucracies, but also in things like engaging with the neoliberal agenda around choice and consumerism and healthcare and education and so on. And then a final strategy, which is, I guess, the one I hadn't thought of, I didn't sort of imagine until I confronted it in reading through these ethnographic accounts, is around personalization, and that's about the effort to build relationships with the state, but still protect a kind of private, intimate sphere. And so these are things like trying to make sure that you always get the same caseworker at the welfare office, trying to make sure to invite the neighbourhood officers or local police into community sphere and out of the kind of comfort zone that they're in, to bring them into your own sphere so that you can perhaps influence your relationship with them and improve that relationship over time.
People who don't know about this world very well, but mostly read the newspapers, they could say, well, where does this differ from playing the system with strategies?
Right.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is playing the system, right? Often it's going beyond playing the system and actually, illicit activities. And sometimes it's doing things that seem to be irrational. So, as an example that sticks in the mind is Victor Rios has written a really fantastic ethnography of young men in Oakland who are, highly policed, in a highly policed community. And he describes them as being dummy smart. And what he means by that is that they deliberately provoke the police and their teachers. They deliberately go out of their way to kind of inflame conflict, and then at the moment that the trouble brews, they then immediately assert they kind of flick a switch and they immediately assert their rights and understand the protections that they have from law enforcement, for example, and talk about it as a kind of quite deliberate strategy that has a kind of symbolic game, a building of a sense of solidarity among a kind of a group that might otherwise have is under the thumb of authorities.
Okay. Now, benefits to low-income groups in society is a field that is fraught with moral ambiguity and moral conflict in particular. So, if you scale this up a little bit, how does this differ from the strategies that high-income groups use in their encounters with the state, like tax evasion, or
Right.
tax avoidance, or lobbying to, build relationships with powerful politicians that can do something for them?
Right. I mean, it's actually not. I've not thought of it in that sense, but that's an interesting way to look at it. And actually, I mean, in relation to some of the strategies that are used, I mean, one of the findings from the project is that in lots of ways it's easier for those with social, economic capital to the resources and the capacity and the kind of existing efficacy to pursue a lot of these strategies as well. So when we're talking about areas of the state where it only includes people who are typically on low incomes and racialized minorities, the strategies, you can talk. It's quite easy to talk about them in a positive kind of way, but when we're talking about other faces of the state that really affect everybody, that we can see these inequalities even at that level. So, for example, engaging with choice in healthcare or education, there are big advantages in the kind of weapons that people can use if they have the resources available. But yeah, I mean, what you're inferring there is that you can apply it at a kind of a more extreme scales, things like tax evasion and the capacity and the resource. But I think the same logic applies, right? That the playing field becomes very uneven, and I guess shining a light on that's really important.
Okay, thank you. Now, I understand you use a very interesting and innovative methodology here. And instead of knocking on doors and ask people, well, what is your experience with the disability administration or the rehabilitation services where you got out of prison? You use a different methodology. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so I use a technique called meta-ethnography, and in effect, what I'm doing is reusing the material of people who've gone and done the door knocking and gone out into the field and done the work. So the idea is that it is a way of synthesizing. So I use that word quite carefully. That's the word that's used. It's a kind of way of synthesizing insight from ethnographic material. So it's not a kind of accumulation. So there are techniques that try to kind of accumulate insight from qualitative work, and that's not what this is. This is an attempt to synthesize, and it kind of is very much in the interpretive tradition of understanding that context really matters, and that you can't create clear kind of indicators or background conditions in a very clear way, but actually you need to kind of understand the underpinning narratives and, that explain the practices that underlie them. So it's an attempt to kind of synthesize from very, very different contexts, often, insights at a higher level that might cover patterns. So in my case, I'm looking at these weapons, or the repertoires in which the weapons sit, the weapons of the meek, I call them, as a way of kind of organizing patterns from across very different. So, I mean, we're talking, so one chapter looks at the weapons of the weak in response to the carceral state, and my kind of understanding of the carceral state goes from prisons, incarceration as we might understand it kind of traditionally, to highly policed communities, to border control and the crimmigration kind of infrastructure that surrounds immigration. And this isn't just in one country, but in the attempt here is to bring in ethnographies from across broadly similar kind of global north advanced established democracies. But the emphasis is on very rich ethnographic material that underlies that. So while the criteria for what's included in that scope is quite large, the criteria in terms of the richness of the underlying material is much narrower, because the focus is really on being able to reuse and repurpose often what is often really, really rich, interesting, evocative material that can, we can see that might speak to other contexts that are similar. And that my attempt is, it's an interesting paper published recently in APSR, which surprised me. It was an APSR by Erica Simmons and Nick Rush-Smith, that talks about the process of translation. And it's like, yes, this is the right word for what I'm trying to do. It's a kind of translation rather than a kind of old-fashioned generalizability. It's this idea of translating across contexts.
The image that comes to my mind when you talk about this is grounded theory.
Yes, very much.
Is it?
Yeah, so there are definite affinities with that attempt to
conceptualizing on the basis of data while sticking close to the data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we should stop here and for this wonderful interview.